I'm wrong, Brianna, but if people want to turn their videos on, you can. You
Yep.
also don't have to show yourself on video. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll also make time at the end for questions. So if you want to, verbalize your question, that's totally great too. And then I think if you don't want to be seen in the recording, or you don't want your name to show up, if you keep your video off, we can eliminate you. Is that right, Brianna?
Yep, that's correct. So we're gonna start recording here, and so yeah, just set your screen up however you want, however you feel comfortable, and we'll get started in just a couple minutes.
Wonderful. I hope you had a chance to enjoy this beautiful weather that we had today. Okay. Welcome, Susan. If anybody else wants to introduce yourself in the chat, feel free to. And then again, if you have questions as we go, we'll do our best to monitor the chat, but we'll also make sure to check it at the end for those questions as well. And if I know some folks are probably experienced gardeners, so if you're looking at the chat and have an answer or have something you want to add in, let's all share our knowledge. So feel free to chime in yourself as well. So I think, welcome Tracy from Belgrade, wonderful. Let's get started. So today we are talking about, we're talking about container and small space gardening. Myself, I'm Stephanie, and I'll let Maddie introduce herself here in a second as well. But we both work with Gallatin Valley Farm to School, which is a locally based nonprofit that works to connect families and kids with healthy local produce and local farmers in schools, in the community, and at their homes as well. So we do lots of different programs in schools. We do summer camps. Today we were out at the Story Mill Gardens, getting them all prepped and ready for growing lots of food for our camps and other programs and food bank this summer. And Maddie also was over at Irving Elementary, I think, doing some Earth Day projects with the kids over there. So you might have seen us around in the community. You might not have, but welcome. And we hope to get to know you better tonight too and share some information with you. Maddie, do you want to introduce yourself and then we'll get started on our agenda?
Sure. I'm Maddie. I'm a Food Corps service member. So it's a branch of AmeriCorps, and I've been with Gallatin Valley Farm to School for 2 years now, just working as an educator, doing nutrition and garden and food education at the elementary schools around Bozeman. Happy to be here tonight with you all.
So today we're going to do a few quick introductions, and then we're going to be talking mostly about how to grow food in a small space. So we did a webinar last week with the Seed Library, which we're just so glad to be partnering with them. They're a great resource and such a cool thing for our community to have. And that was sort of about planning your garden more in general. Today we're going to be talking, we'll share a little bit of those tips and tricks from planning your garden. But we're also going to talk about sort of how to maximize your harvest in a small space. We'll be talking a lot about container gardening, but a lot of these tricks you can also take away if you have a small space that's in the ground too, or if you have a small raised bed. I myself am gardening this year in 2 sort of 2 foot by 4 foot raised beds and then a bunch of containers. So I've been learning a lot as I've been preparing this webinar too. We'll talk about supplies that you might need, some different things to think about for both if you use containers, but also for small space, what kind of soil you want to look for and use, what kind of support materials so you can get the most out of your space, where you want to put your garden, things to think about of keeping your garden alive. And then we'll also talk about how to maximize your space and your harvest in that. So whether that is looking at ways to grow things upward, intercropping and companion planting, and then also extending your season, because here in Bozeman and the surrounding area, pretty much all of Montana, we have a pretty short season. So there's a lot of things you can do to sort of help your plants survive through that or give them a little leg up in that. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll have time for questions too at the end and to share our own information as well. So just to introduce ourselves a little bit more, I'm the education director at Gallatin Valley Farm to School, which means I think I have a really fun job. I just get to help support our educators and help support our programs so that we can connect with kids and families and get them knowledge and nutritious food so that they can eat better and support local farmers. I have been gardening for over a decade now. I've really been gardening ever since my mom let me plant some pole beans when I was about 5 years old, but I've been gardening for my own food supply for about 11 years. I started growing in Missoula, which is a similar but a little bit more mild climate than Bozeman, so I'm learning to adapt here. And I love to grow all sorts of things. Some things I grow better than others, and I really enjoy growing lots of different varieties of tomatoes. So that's something that I'm in my new smaller garden where I live currently. I'm going to have to learn how to adapt those to growing in containers, and I'm excited about that challenge this summer.
Yeah, I am, like I said, an educator at Farm to School. I have 7 seasons of farm and garden experience. I started out as an organic farmer, and I've since shifted to more of the education role. I started farming in New Jersey, the Garden State, and my favorite thing to grow is probably peas if I had to choose between peas and carrots, but I love pulling carrots out of the ground too. So excited for those this season.
Nice.
Awesome. Okay, so before we talk about what soil you need and where to put your containers, we need to figure out what to grow. So it's important to ask yourself why you're growing. Are you growing for food or aesthetics or just for a fun hobby or maybe some other reason? Whatever that reason is, understanding why you're growing will help you understand what to grow and how much to grow. And you'll also want to consider how much time you're willing to put into this and how much labor you're willing to put into this before you get carried away and, I don't know, plant a lot more than you can handle. So figure out what to grow and why you're growing, and that can lead the rest of your garden season.
Okay. And so when you're thinking about small spaces, there's another consideration you want to make in addition to what types of plants you want to grow. Do you want flowers? Do you want vegetables? Which kind of vegetables do you want? You also want to think about what's going to grow well in small spaces. So some of the things that tend to grow well in small spaces are, as you would guess, small plants. Some of the plants that are small include lettuces, greens, whether it's kale or spinach or chard. Also plants with shallow root systems. So most containers tend to be, maybe a foot deep. With those, you want to plant plants that have shallower roots. So Maddie and I, as we were planning this, we were sort of brainstorming, what are things that just we've never had success with in containers? And we were thinking root vegetables are something that, for us at least, haven't really worked too well, like beets, sort of the longer carrots. If you personally have had success with that, feel free to share it in the chat or share it at the end while we talk. I'd love to know your hints, but that can be something that can be a challenge. Another plant's like, for instance, lettuce has a really shallow root system, so they go really well in containers. Another thing that you could look for are compact and bush varieties. So bush variety, the thing I think of is like bushy cucumbers. There's 2 different kinds of cucumbers. There's cucumbers that are the vining cucumbers, and then there's cucumbers that just sort of create a bush. So you can grow vining cucumbers in a container or in a small space for sure, but in that case, you want to probably think about trellising them, having them grow up something. Otherwise, what they're going to do is just take off and take over your whole space. So especially if you're growing in the ground in a small space or in a bed in a small space, if you plant like a pumpkin plant that's not a bushy pumpkin, all of a sudden the pumpkin's going to take over the whole space, which maybe if you're growing if you just want to grow one big Halloween pumpkin for yourself and that's your goal, go for it. But if you want to have a lot of different things, try to plant those more compact varieties. Another thing you might want to look for is, for instance, if you're growing tomato plants, there's 2 different types of tomatoes. There's tomatoes called indeterminate and determinate, and they'll say that usually on the seed pack or in the seed catalog, what the variety that you're looking at is. But the difference is determinate tomatoes grow to a certain size, and then they set all their fruit pretty much at once. Indeterminate tomatoes, sorry, will just keep growing and growing and growing, which is really fun, but they can get really, really big. So again, if you're having a small space, some of those determinate varieties can help. If you do want to grow carrots in a container, I put a picture here of these ones called French market or Parisian market carrots. They grow like little sort of hailstone or golf ball size carrots. They grow fast, they grow short, and I've had success with that particular variety in a container before. And also they're nice for a small space and they're sort of fun. And then there's some compact, some people will say you can't grow corn in containers. There's also compact corns. One of the varieties that I like to grow is called Tom Thumb popcorn. It grows about 3 to 4 feet tall and makes these little, about 4-inch long corn ears that are really fun to grow and they taste good. There's also some hybrid corn varieties that are grown especially for containers and for small spaces. So if you look again at the seed packet, you're going to learn a lot about it. If some companies, including some of our local seed companies, like there's a great company out of the Mission Valley called Triple Divide Seeds. They don't put a ton of information on their seed packets, but they have a great website. So the seed packets combined with online seed catalogs will tell you, is this something that grows in a small space? You can even grow peas in a small space in containers. I like this variety called Tender Sweet Peas because they sort of just grow this bush of peas, and I can put them in a bucket and have a bunch of sweet peas to eat without having to trellis them. So just sort of think about your space and try to look for those varieties of things that might be smaller. They'll say things like compact plants or grows well in containers or grows well in small spaces. Another thing that grows super well in containers is potatoes. And in fact, I have gotten to the point where I exclusively grow my potatoes in containers because I think it's really easy to harvest them and really fun to grow them that way. So what you can do is you can want something sort of big, maybe like a large pot, or I've tried and I've used and had a lot of success with the trash can. Like I lost the lid in a windstorm to one of my trash cans. So I put some holes in the bottom of it. You put about 3 to 4 inches of soil and then put a seed potato in it. We are, as in Bozeman, we're in a great place to get local seed potatoes from folks in Amsterdam and the surrounding areas. They grow a lot of seed potatoes, so you can get those. And then you want to have at least one little shoot coming off of your potato. Put it down in the dirt, cover it up again with a few inches of soil, but don't fill the whole thing up. Then as your potato grows, it'll have a green sprout, and you just sort of like every 4 inches or so, cover it up with more dirt. Cover it with more dirt, and eventually it gets to the top. And then when you get to the fall, you can just dump the whole thing out and pick up all your potatoes. It's really fun, especially if you have kids. It's super fun to just go through your pile and find all the potatoes. I got this photo from the British Columbian Master Gardener site. The only thing I would say, and what I've learned from growing a lot of potatoes in containers, is I would not start with that many potatoes in the bottom. Just do like 1 or 2 in a large container because they really do spread around and take space up. So don't crowd them in there. So yeah, there's lots of fun ways you can use for both small space and containers. You just have to be a little bit mindful when you're picking out your varieties to make sure that you're choosing something that will fit in those areas.
Awesome. So let's talk about containers and what you're going to put your plants in. There is a huge variety of containers you can use, and there really are not many rules. Basically, anything could be a container, but there are a few rules and they're important. So your containers should have holes in the bottom to let water drain out. I know that sometimes people say you can put rocks in the bottom of your containers and that will provide the drainage that your plants need. I have tried this and Stephanie has tried this, and neither of us have had success with this. If you have, drop it in the chat. Let us know what your tips were. That's awesome. I've used the rock method for indoor plants and that seems to work well, but for outdoor plants and vegetables, not had success. So make sure those containers have holes in the bottom for your water to get out. Your containers should be able to withstand the elements. So something that I really like to do is use toilet paper rolls and paper towel rolls to start my seeds. But I know that if I were to leave smaller plants in there outside all summer long, the pots would just fall apart. So make sure that there's something that can withstand the rain or the hail or whatever crazy weather we're going to get this summer. Another tip would be to avoid metal containers. The metal containers can get hot and they can be a hazard when you go to do maintenance in your garden. So I would say avoid that if possible. Also, if you're reusing containers from a previous season, make sure you thoroughly clean those containers out to remove any disease or pests that might be lingering in those containers from the season before. Just give your pots a fresh start and your plants the best chance of survival. And then as you can see in this picture and the next slide, there are lots of creative ideas that you can use for containers. You can find things around your house or upcycle different containers. Something that we use a lot at Farm to School are yogurt containers and 5-gallon buckets. We've had a lot of success with those, but as you'll see, Stephanie, if you want to click to the next slide, people get really crazy with their ideas. If any of you have used awesome containers or creative ideas, let us know in the chat. I would love to hear some wild container stories. And Brianna and I were talking before this. She was saying that she lived down the street from someone who used a bathtub. I've seen a toilet used. So the possibilities are really endless when it comes to what you're going to use for your container garden.
There was a gentleman who lived down the street from me when I lived in Missoula who had 5-gallon buckets all through his whole yard was full of 5-gallon buckets. He had sort of gotten rid of his grass, but just put buckets, and he grew hundreds of pounds of food and donated it to the food bank every single year. And just in these 5-gallon buckets, it was amazing to see. And it was really beautiful once they all started growing. So
it's awesome. Okay, so let's talk about soil. Local nurseries and hardware stores usually have a couple of different options for potting mix. And a lot of places will even sell bulk soil. So not in bags, but just loose soil that you can go pick up or that you can have delivered. I know, Stephanie, did you find out about Cashman? I know they deliver for you.
I didn't. I'm sorry. I forgot to ask the OER employee who also works at Cashman's at the same time. But a lot of places, if you have a pickup truck, you can go and get a scoop full of soil, put it in the back of your pickup truck too. So, and I bet Cashman's would do it for you.
Yeah, I think so. And when you're looking for what potting mix to buy, it's important that you have a few components. So we like to make sure our soil has compost, peat moss, and then vermiculite or perlite. Compost is basically food for your plants. It'll add organic matter to your soil, and it's an essential ingredient when you're making your potting mix. Peat moss is great at retaining water and nutrients, so it'll help hold those nutrients from the compost in your soil for longer, and it'll help hold water in those pots. And then vermiculite or perlite, you don't have to use both necessarily, but these do a couple of things. They make dense soil lighter and more airy, and they also improve water retention. So I would say those 3 or 4 components are essential in your soil. And you can check soil bags to see that they have these components, or you can buy the components separately and mix them yourself. And there are a lot of videos online that you can watch to learn the ratios and to learn how to mix. So this little preschooler in the picture is showing us how you can mix your own soil with a stick and a bucket. And then I would say one thing to avoid would be scooping soil from the earth into your containers. A lot of the soil around here, if you put it into a bucket and water it, it can have drainage issues. The water might not drain very well. Or if you grab soil from the earth, it can have weeds in it. So you want to avoid doing that and either make your own soil mix or buy it from the store. Awesome. And then irrigation. There are a couple of different options you can use for your containers or small spaces. And they have varying degrees of labor that you would need to put in for your watering. So the hose and watering can method, that's really simple to use. It's probably the most labor intensive. You need to do it every couple of days. And the benefit of this is that it allows you to see how much water your plants are actually getting. So you know they're getting that water. Drip irrigation is a little bit harder to set up. You probably need to do some research. You might need to install it yourself, or you can hire someone to install the irrigation. But once it's set up, if you put it on a timer, you don't really have to think about it. One thing to remember though, is you still want to check your plants, even if they are on irrigation, or if you're using wicking beds or some other self-watering method, just to make sure that they're not drying out, because container gardens tend to dry out more quickly than raised beds or in-ground beds. So just be aware that if you watered your containers a few days ago, they're probably really dry, even if your raised beds are still holding that water. And then wicking beds are another fun option. You can make your own wicking beds or you can buy them. And these are beds that hold water in a reservoir below the soil. So you fill them up. This bottom picture here shows 3 wicking beds. You pour water into those tubes and the water sits in the reservoir. And when the plants need the water, their roots go down into that water and pull it up. So that's also a little bit less labor intensive once you have the setup. But again, you're going to want to make sure those plants are getting enough water if you leave them for a few days on their own. And then Stephanie added this awesome quick tip for when you're traveling. You can fill a glass bottle or jar with water, and then you can stick it upside down into an already watered container, and it'll slowly release that water over a couple of days. And your plants should be okay if you want to go on that backpacking trip or leave town for a little while. So yeah, just choose which irrigation would be best for you. Maybe you enjoy watering your plants every day and getting out there in the morning, and it's a nice ritual for you. That's my go-to for sure. But maybe you don't have time for that, and drip irrigation would suit you better. So just choose what you need. Okay, let's talk about plant support. So using a trellis or ladders or different materials to help your plants climb is important for things like peas and pole beans, cucumbers, and tomatoes. And like Stephanie said, you can definitely look for varieties that will bush out instead of climb up. But if you already have these seeds that climb, or if you like to watch them climb, it's pretty easy and simple to get these materials in Bozeman, or honestly, I found a lot of these materials just on the side of the road. I think people like to get new ones every year. So if you're driving around Bozeman this time of year, it's a good time to find tomato cages or old fencing at the side of the road, and you can use that for your trellises. These things are also frequently listed on the Bozeman listserv or local buy-sell trade websites like Craigslist. So just keep your eyes out and get creative. If you have some stakes or some bamboo poles and some rope, you can rig up your own trellises to help your little plant babies in your containers climb and thrive. Okay, so where to place your containers? The first thing to do would be read the seed packets. And sorry, these seed packets are a little bit small, but above the red lines, you can see that the seed packets say either something like select a sunny location or put in full sun or partial shade. So the seed packets are a good place to start for knowing where to put your containers. I would also advise putting your containers in north facing areas. That way they'll get continuous sunlight throughout the day in our northern area. Other things to consider when you're placing your containers would be to think about the messiness of the containers. So if you have a really nice deck or you have some pristine concrete, you probably want to avoid putting your containers on there if you don't want to get rings from the containers. The water, when it drains out, and the soil, when it starts to drain out, will leave a ring when you move those containers. So just be aware of that when you're placing them. If you have a nice deck or something, maybe avoid putting it there. Also, I would say avoid putting it on grass. The containers will kill the grass. So maybe find a pallet or something that you can prop it up onto. That if you put it on grass, it also risks letting grass grow into the container. So we want to avoid that, avoid the weeds as much as possible. One other thought, consider how hot the surface will get where you're putting your containers. If you're putting them on a black driveway, that might be great for things that like to be warm, like tomatoes, but it might be less ideal for things that don't like the heat as much, like strawberries or greens. So just consider that when you're placing your containers.
Okay, so we've been talking about some of the things that you need to do to keep your garden alive already, but just to sort of summarize it, your garden plants, just like any other plants, need some certain sort of elements to keep them alive. They need water, nutrients, sun, space. And another thing you want to think about is pests and disease. And I personally I found this example of this container garden. I think these folks are growing in Texas. You can see some big sort of garden plants and sort of jungly things there. But I just love, I don't know, I think it's a beautiful mess that they have going on because it talks about a little bit, it sort of takes into account a lot of these things. So one thing is water. You want to keep things damp, but they don't need to be soaking. You sort of want to let your soil get to a point where it's drying out enough between each plant. So a good idea is you can go and, especially if you're hand watering them, stick your finger in and see, is it moist? Is it soaking? Is it dry? If it's sort of moist, that's a good place to be. If you keep it so damp, you can risk having molds and other sort of diseases happen. So you don't want to just soak it all the time, but you also don't want things to get so dry that your plants are struggling or wilting. So you want sort of that balance there. Another thing you want a good balance with is nutrients. And that's one of the reasons that we recommend using a soil mix that has compost in it. And if you are gardening not in containers, but in a small space, that's a good reason to add some compost to your small space to get those natural nutrients in there. A lot of times you can also use fertilizers for this. And a lot of times you'll see fertilizers that have a number on them. It'll be a number to number to number sort of ratio. And what that means, that's how many parts nitrogen to phosphorus to potassium, which are 3 of the macronutrients that all plants need. So nitrogen is sort of like the protein for your plants. It's what gives them the green leafy growth. Plants like kale love nitrogen. Phosphorus is a really important element for when your plants are flowering and fruiting. And then potassium is really important for strong root and stem growth. So it's important to have a good balance of them. And some folks get even pretty fancy throughout the year when they're growing. Like they might try to use a fertilizer that has higher potassium when they first plant their starts so that the roots can get really strong and established. Then switch to something that's a little bit higher in that nitrogen part of the ratio so it can establish some leafy growth. And then a lot of folks will recommend, especially like when your tomatoes are starting to need to set their fruit, to back off on the nitrogen, which then increases the phosphorus ratio so that they're flowering and fruiting. So if you see a plant that's like if your tomato plant or your pumpkin plant is just growing green, 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 and it's not setting fruit, it's not making tomatoes or pumpkins or cucumbers, you probably have too much nitrogen that you're feeding it, or nitrogen in your soil. And vice versa too. If you have a plant that's just sort of piddling along and it has like especially yellow leaves in the older leaves of it that are just yellow and falling off, probably doesn't have enough nitrogen in it. So that's a really good thing to think about. And one of the best things about compost, in addition to the fact that it holds onto water and it's just good in general, is that it tends to have a good natural balance of those things. So it's a great thing to add to your soil before you start planting. Afterwards, one thing that I personally like to use, because I like to grow my vegetables organically, a good fertilizer you can use is fish emulsion fertilizer, which is sort of it's a excess from the fishing industry. There's a brand called Alaska, which I think are like bycatch or fish guts or something. They swirl it all up and get this like fish smoothie. sort of smelly, but it works really good on your plants. And that can have a nice, good natural balance too. But there's lots of different amendments you can use to sort of help with that. There's other micronutrients that are also important, calcium, magnesium, and other ones. And again, a lot of that will be naturally found in things like compost. So it's a really great thing to use and to have. Another thing to think about, and like Maddie was talking about, is see what your seed catalog or your seed packet says about the sun. Some plants like more shade than others. Tomatoes, for instance, love full sun. Squash plants can do with a little bit of shade. So if you see here in this picture, those plants that are underneath, like the ones on the top level, are like tomatoes and peppers. And then they've actually got some squash plants that are tucked underneath there because they can be in that space. So in my garden this year, I have a bed that's in part shade, and I'm going to put things like lettuce and zucchinis there. A zucchini will do well in the full sun too, but the zucchini is going to do good no matter where you put it. So figure I'll put it in the shade and see how it goes. And if I don't get as many zucchini, that's fine because they make a lot. There's some places in the world, Bozeman's, we've got a pretty cold to mild summer here. So it's not going to be the end of the world if your part shade plant is in the full sun. Full sun is great, but there's actually some places like in Arizona where scientists have done research and actually recommended that folks plant certain plants like lettuces and kales underneath their solar panels and underneath things so that plants will actually grow more in a little bit of shade rather than in that full desert sun. So think about that. And then for space, pretty straightforward, give your plants enough space. So put bigger plants in bigger containers. Here you can see in the front, they've got so those are compact determinate tomato varieties in those sort of small rectangular containers. They've got some indeterminate, it looks like potato or tomato varieties in the back. I apologize that I keep mixing up potatoes and tomatoes, you guys, but the ones with the fruits on them are tomatoes. And then they've got those bigger buckets that are holding what look like squash and other sort of large plants. So again, when you're thinking about like, what kind of containers do I have, or what kind of space do I have if you're growing right in the ground, give your plants enough room and put the bigger things in the bigger spaces. And then something to think about too is pests and disease. And the best way that you can monitor this, like the biggest tip I can give you is just pay attention to your plants. So that's another advantage of going out there and checking the water, checking on them, trying to spend some time, even if it's just like taking your novel out and reading in your garden for a little bit. If you have some time, just spend some time with them and keep an eye on them. Because one of the best defenses against pests and disease is getting on top of it quick. So if you start to see aphids, you'll see it quick and be able to deal with them rather than you've got a full blown infestation of your whole garden. There's lots of tips for how you can get rid of pests and disease. With the extension office is a really great resource, especially if you have like a mystery. A lot of times you can just take it to extension and they'll help you diagnose what's wrong with your plant. If you see things like mold or white mildew happening on your plants, that's caused just like any other kind of mildew by overwatering and getting too much water on their leaves. So you can adjust it that way. If you see things like your colors of your plant leaves are turning yellow or purple instead of green, that's probably some kind of a nutrient deficiency that you can adjust with fertilizer. Aphids are pretty easy to get rid of if you especially early on, if you spray them with a hose because they don't have wings. So you spray them and then they fall off and they can't get back on your plant. Another thing to help with pests is to have good bugs. So if you welcome ladybugs and other things like that to your garden, that's going to help get rid of things like aphids. And a nice thing about containers is that if you see that one plant has disease, you can remove it and isolate it and you can quarantine your plant away from your other plants so that it doesn't spread. So if you see like aphids on one of your kale plants, you could pull that kale plant container away from your other kale plant containers before they can spread all over the other ones. So just something to think about. And like I said, paying attention really helps with that. So we talked about, whether it's containers or a small space on your in your garden, you want to sort of maximize your space. And one of the best ways that you can do that is by intercropping or companion planting your plants. So that is basically planting plants together that are going to use different things and maybe even benefit each other. So you can fit more stuff in. You're still able to give your plants space, but you're able to fit more things into a space. So for instance, if you plant kale and lettuce together, the kale is going to grow all summer and it's going to start growing up taller. The lettuce gets harvested sooner. And so by the time that you pull your lettuce out, that's when your kale or your broccoli or your cabbages might be getting really big and take into that space. And they also use slightly different things. That would be an example of intercropping. They don't really benefit each other so much, but they're just fine to put next to each other because they use slightly different spaces. There's also companion planting, which is when plants can actually benefit each other. So a great example of this is you'll often see basil and marigolds planted near tomato plants. The basil and the marigolds not only are beautiful and basil tastes good with tomatoes, but they actually they're more fragrant plants and they can help deter pests. So especially marigolds, they produce a chemical that helps deter pests from your tomato plants. Another thing that is a very famous companion planting is the Three Sisters garden, which is corn and beans and squash together. So your corn grows up and then it provides a trellis, a natural trellis for your beans to grow up. And meanwhile, the squash sort of spreads out on the ground and it keeps the soil cool and it helps to reduce weeds. Corn really does not like weeds. And so the shading of the ground and the sort of natural mulching of the squash can help with that. And so not only does it help make the most of your space, but it increases the diversity of your garden. And the more diverse your garden is, the more habitat you're going to have for beneficial insects, and the less likely that you're going to have just like one disease that sweeps across your whole monocrop of crops. So this is a great resource from the Farmer's Almanac about companion planting, but also if you look online for companion planting ideas, there's lots of them. There's also a great book that I love called Carrots Love Tomatoes, which carrots really do love tomatoes and tomatoes love carrots. Carrots have helped to keep pests off of tomatoes, and then the carrots sort of just grow underneath your tomatoes all summer. And then once you pull up your tomato plants, once they're frozen and dead in the fall, because they'll die at the first freeze if you don't protect them, the carrots are still sort of going under there. They're a little bit more frost hardy, and then you can pick them and enjoy a fall carrot crop. So there's lots of great ways to sort of maximize your space that way. And here's some examples of container companion planting, which I think not only are really cool, they're beautiful too. So here we've got some marigolds and basil planted near a tomato plant. You can see here they also did some trellising with their tomatoes. So the tomatoes are growing up and leaving space for the other flowers around the outside. Same thing within these rectangular containers. They've got some greens. I think that's pak choy and maybe some other lettuces growing around the bottom of some beans. So the beans are growing up the trellis, and then these other shallow rooted things are growing near the edges, and you can harvest those. Some people also have trellised their tomatoes up, and then they have lettuce growing in the bottom of them. And this image with the terracotta pots down at the bottom in the boxes, I thought was really interesting because some of those plants aren't necessarily like intercropped in the same pots. They're all small pots, but they're still together. So they've got those fragrant herbs that can help to deter pests. And then they've also got like strawberries and some other vegetables growing there. So you can still do that sort of beneficial having good plants near each other, even if you're using smaller pots that might only fit one kind of plant at a time. So there's lots of great ideas out there. And I also just recommend like trying stuff and seeing what happens. And maybe it works well, maybe it doesn't work well. Last year I tried to I had so much success with planting carrots near my tomatoes that I tried to plant carrots near my eggplants because I figured, well, eggplants are a cousin of tomatoes, maybe it'll work. The problem was that the eggplants don't grow as tall as tomatoes, so they couldn't outgrow the carrots. And it really took a hit on my eggplants. I got great carrots, I got barely any eggplants. So I won't do that again, but it was a good learning experience. And I just tried it in a small section of my garden and learned from it. So give it a go. Another season extension that you can do is to do succession planting, which is planting some of your seeds sort of a little bit at a time. And this is really helpful for some plants that grow fast and that need to be harvested quick. So for instance, if you plant your lettuce all at once, in about a month and a half, you will have more lettuce than you can possibly make salads for, unless you, even if you really love salads, you'll just have so much lettuce. And that's great, except that a few weeks after that, your lettuce will all go to flower. And when lettuce goes to flower, it starts to get really bitter. It doesn't taste good. And then you get really sad because you feel like you wasted a bunch of lettuce. So what you can do instead of that is plant maybe a quarter of your lettuce. And then 2 weeks later, plant another quarter of your lettuce. And then 2 weeks after that, plant some more lettuce. That way it's sort of coming on in waves so you can handle it better and use it better. Some of the plants that do that, lettuce is one of them. Arugula also will come up quickly. You can plant arugula in your garden now and have it ready in a month to a month and a half from now. But then it will shortly put flowers up. So you want to sort of have them while they're green. Cilantro is another one. Cilantro really likes to go right in the ground, be direct seeded. You want to wait a little bit for that one. It's more of a hot weather crop, but in a month or so, you can plant your cilantro out. But then again, it'll bolt. And then you get coriander, which is great. If you let it go to seed and then harvest those seeds, you'll have coriander. But maybe you want your cilantro for your salsa or something. So if you want that steady stream of stuff, consider planting it a little bit at a time. Carrots is another one that a lot of people do with succession planting. They will not flower. They're a biennial crop, so they will stay just growing their roots until you pull them. But if you plant a little bit now, you can enjoy them when your lettuce is ready in your salads. And then you can plant some later on in the year and have them for storing into the fall. So there's a lot of plants you can do that with. There's also a lot of information out there about succession planting. And one of my favorites is if you go to Johnny's Seed Company. They're a company out of Maine. So they do a lot of cold weather planting. And they have a great information on succession planting calendars. And also they have this calculator spreadsheet. So you can put in there like what variety you have, how many days it says it takes to mature off your seed packet, and how often you want to plant it. And it will calculate this little spreadsheet out for you exactly when you should plant each of your dates. So really great resource. And another thing you can do that's sort of like succession planting is, and again, to maximize a small space, you can try to plant some cold season crops like right now, like arugula. You could plant some arugula or some radishes and have them ready to harvest because they grow really fast and they do well in cold weather. By the time that June comes along, when you should try to plant tomatoes outside. So you could, use one small space to grow 2 crops. There's not many things in Montana that we can do with that because there's such a short growing season, but some of those crops will work. Another thing some people do is like, if you harvest something out, like if you have garlic growing in your garden right now, maybe you pull your garlic up in June, July when it's ready, and then you could plant daikon radishes or some winter carrots that you might want to have that'll be ready to go later on. So you can sort of think about, you've got this limited amount of space. How could I maximize it by maybe having multiple crops in there? And then the last thing to think about is extending your season. So like we've mentioned here, it gets cold in Montana, as I'm sure most of you are aware of, if not all of you. We have a very short growing season, especially here in Bozeman where we're pretty high up. So we tend to get, being at that higher altitude, we get more freezing nights later into the year and more freezing nights earlier into the fall than say someplace lower like Missoula even. So if you try to plant your tomatoes out in early May, there's a good chance that your tomatoes are going to have to face some freezing temperatures. So you can do that. And what you'll see some folks around here do is they plant their hot crops out earlier, but then they cover them and try to sort of protect them from the frost, whether it's using a good old-fashioned towel or blanket or sheet. Some folks here are protecting their crops using cups. Or you can also use more fancy fabric like there's this, I know it by the name brand Remade, but it's like a sort of see-through white fabric that you can buy at the hardware store, and that works really well on crops. Another thing that's really nice about container gardening, though, is that you can bring them inside if it's going to freeze, or throw them in your garage or your shed if it's going to freeze. So I personally have never gotten it together to build rolling plant stands for myself, but my mom had my dad do it, and they love them. So they plant tomatoes and basils and all sorts of stuff out there. And then if they see that the frost is predicted, they just roll them inside off their patio and keep them inside for the night, and then roll them back outside. So you can always, that's another great thing about growing in containers, is you have that flexibility. Or later in the season, as we start to see our frosts, some of those plants can just come inside with you. You know, maybe you have a compact tomato plant that you still have some tomatoes growing on, and you want to just take it inside. So there's lots of ways you can sort of think about that. And then the last thing too to think about is planting some frost tolerant crops. So again, kale will survive down to the high 20s, depending on the variety of it. So you can, or maybe even lower than that. It's got natural antifreeze inside of it that it produces, and it helps it survive. So things like kale, spinach, radishes, peas. I have some peas that are up in my garden right now. They were totally fine when it froze the other day. They're still growing. So there's a lot of crops that you can start planting now, or that you can plant and then have into the winter. Eventually it's going to get too cold here for them, but until the ground freezes, until we get those hard frosts, whenever those come, that can really work. And also you can start crops inside and then move them outside. So things like, if you want to start tomatoes from seed, if you want to start peppers from seed, I would get on it soon, but right now you could still plant them from seed and then have them ready to go in early June, when it's a good time to plant them outside. So just to sort of plan that out and think about it. And I think that is our last sort of tip that we wanted to share, but we've got some time left. We've got about 10 minutes until 8 o'clock. So if anybody has questions, feel free to either turn your mic on and ask away, or else type them into the chat and we'll take a look at those and try to answer those for you. Could you talk a bit more about composting in containers? So that's a great question, Becca. Thank you. I think what we were referring to is putting compost into your containers. So using that as part of your soil. You can compost in a container. Like there's lots of like tumbling composters and things like that you can buy, but we weren't particularly talking about, unless I'm misunderstanding the question, we're saying like sort of to put some compost into your containers. Although a really cool raised bed / sort of container garden idea to look into if you're interested in that is called the keyhole garden method, which is basically like, it's a ring of garden bed around, and then you have like one little cutaway that you can get into. So it's sort of like a keyhole. And then in the middle, people will put their compost pile. And so what that does is sort of the compost will break down and feed the roots of your plants that are growing in the area around it. So that's a really cool sort of sustainable method for doing a composting in a raised bed garden situation. And if you Google keyhole garden, you'll get a lot of great examples of that. Susan had a great question. Can you reuse seeds from last year? Yes, you can. It depends if you're, so if you are reusing, like, here, I'll grab it for you. So here's my box, of seeds that I have at my house, and it just crashed on another thing. These seeds are collected. Some of them are like from 2015. So you can reuse certain seeds. Some of them will lose their viability over time. And Maddie, do you want to share with us how you can test seed viability to see if they'll sprout?
Sure. We also have an awesome video about this on our YouTube page that one of our board members put together. She is an amazing gardener, and it's all about doing a germination test for your seeds to test the viability before you plant them and they don't grow. So basically the method is you need a paper towel and some plastic bags and some water and your seeds. You'll lay your paper towel flat on the table, put your seeds inside the paper towel, fold it up into a nice little package, and then either spray that water on or drip it on, and then put that little paper towel, the wet paper towel with the seeds inside, into a Ziploc and leave it for a couple of days. And if they sprout in a few days, you'll know that they're viable and they're good to go. And if they don't sprout, you probably should not plant those.
So, and then if you're talking about saving your seeds, you can also save seeds. And I think that the seed library actually might have some instructions on saving certain seeds. There's certain crops that are better for saving seeds from, because those tend to be the self-pollinating crops. If you are saving seeds from tomatoes, for instance, tomatoes, they don't easily pollinate each other. They actually, like, it's really cool. A bumblebee has to pollinate tomatoes, and they do what's called buzz pollination. They clamp onto the tomato plant and then they buzz really, really fast. And that actually shakes the pollen down into from the anthers to the stamen, or from the pistil to the stamen to the pistil, and then they pollinate themselves. So you can take your tomatoes that you have and then save the seeds from those, and those will be the same kind of tomato year after year. Kale, on the other hand, kale is the same thing as, genetically, it's pretty much the same thing as broccoli, and pretty much the same thing as cauliflower, and pretty much the same thing as Brussels sprouts. They all come from the same European mustard plant and have been developed in different parts of the world to have different parts of them be harvestable. But if you try to save your kale seeds after they go to flower, you might get some kind of weird mutant kale, brassica, broccoli plant the next year. And it could be a really fun experiment, but you're not going to be guaranteed to have what you want. So if you want to save seeds, there's lots of great resources about it. I know folks are really trying to have that happen, but there's some good resources out there about that too. So you can save some of your seeds. Beans are another great one that you can save seeds from. Squash tends to work pretty well too. And peppers as well. Peppers are really easy to save seeds from.
And then we had another question. What would you use as a base material for small raised beds? Sand before soil mix, gravel, or straight to dirt? I would recommend a really cheap option is newspaper or cardboard to prevent weeds from getting up into your bed. I would avoid, if you can, putting the soil directly onto the ground or the grass, because that will grow right up through the soil into your beds. So trying to put some kind of biodegradable material down. You can also buy weed, or what is it called? Weed paper, weed cloth you can put down, but I've used cardboard and had success with that.
Does that work year after year?
It depends. It'll break down. So yeah, you might have to replace it every couple of years, I would say.
Although I'll be honest that weed cloth will also break down. The weeds get through your weed cloth eventually. So cardboard works nearly as well as weed cloth, and it's free and more sustainable to just recycle it that way. So,
yeah.
And then gravel and sand before soil mix would also let the weeds go through. So when you have a raised bed that's going right onto the ground, you don't need to worry so much about drainage, because it will drain out, whether it's cardboard or weed cloth or any of those things. So unless you're like trying to save money and trying to not put as much soil mix in, that gravel might be a good option for you, just as some fill material. But I would recommend just, again, because if you do have deep soil, a great thing about raised beds is that they have so much space for the plant's roots to expand down into. So it can be really beneficial for the plants. So if you can figure out a way to afford the soil mix, especially if you mix it yourself, it can be a lot cheaper. And just do like cardboard as a base, and then the soil all the way through the raised bed. That could be really nice for your plants. I've also seen some people that use like wood and sticks down at the bottom. There's a permaculture method called hubaculture that uses like woody biomass in the bottom of things as fill materials. And that's nice because it'll break down slowly. And it also tends to hold on to moisture better than something like sand or gravel would. So if you're looking for fill material, another good base material could be like random limbs from your trees that you're trimming or something like that. Great questions, you guys. Does anybody have any other questions?
There was one that I was sent earlier today by an email. Is it okay if I read that one to you?
Sure.
So this one is from a gal named Margaret in our community, and she is wondering, she made a greenhouse for the first time, and she's wondering how that affects what varieties of, in her case, tomatoes she should plant. Is there anything specific that she should know before she picks out what she's doing? Does that kind of have similar varieties that are good for it, like a container would?
Great question. You can grow a lot of things if you're, tomatoes love greenhouses. So that's really lucky for her. She can grow like a lot of the tomato varieties that we can't grow very well in Bozeman. Like there's a beautiful heirloom tomato called a Brandywine that just tastes amazing, but likes warmer weather than what we tend to have here. She can grow those and grow them to like ripen in the greenhouse. Eggplants also love greenhouses. So a lot of those hot crops like peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, she can grow. She doesn't have to worry about the compact varieties, and she doesn't have to worry about the sort of northern varieties of those. What I might recommend that she could do, depending on the size of her greenhouse, you can actually like run ropes down from the roof of your greenhouse. And the tomatoes, especially if it's an indeterminate variety, so not one that stays compact, you can trellis it all the way up. I've seen pictures of greenhouses in Italy where the tomatoes like grow like vines all the way around the roof of a greenhouse. So you can have them keep growing and growing and growing. And you'll just keep getting more and more of those tomatoes in the indeterminate varieties. So yeah, have fun with that, Margaret.
And I had a question as well, and this is maybe along similar lines. If you don't have a yard and you're only growing in containers, and maybe you're even trying to do it indoors, what kind of plants can you grow just inside your house?
Ooh, good question. Definitely like herbs grow really well inside of houses, things that are leafy. So herbs, lettuce, maybe even some kale, things like that. I have never had success with growing tomatoes in a house before, just because they do really like that hot sun. But if you had a really hot sunny window, you could try it, give it a go. Cherry tomatoes tend to ripen faster than other tomatoes. So maybe try with a cherry tomato so that it be something that will ripen faster. Maddie, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't really have anything to add. I was going to say I've only really had success with herbs indoors.
Sure.
I did know someone in Toronto once so they're a little bit farther south than us, but still Canada. They grew strawberries in windows and had good success with that in pots. And they made this like strawberry hanging planter so the strawberries could grow off the sides of it. So you might try some strawberries too. And Lynn says she has had luck with tomatoes inside with the sunny window. So that's really hopeful and wonderful. Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, give it a go. Wonderful.
That's great. Yeah, if anyone has any further questions, feel free to put them in the chat or turn on your mic and join in.
I actually have a question. According to you, I did everything wrong with my raised bed, which I built last year. And one thing I'm wondering is I did take soil right from my yard. I had a big pile of it. Is it too late to amend it? Would I dig it all out and start all over again?
Oh, no, it's not too late. No, that's not too late. I would add some compost to it, just because compost is always good to add. You might want to dig out like some of it into a wheelbarrow or a bucket or something so that you can get the compost in a little bit deeper, because if it's really full at this point, like it's good to dig the compost in and that just turns up the soil and gives that, but and then put it back in. But yeah, no, I think it's good to have that airiness, and the compost and that organic matter will really help with that. You could also if you find that your raised bed has really dense soil in it, like if you're finding that it's having those drainage issues, adding some peat moss or some perlite or vermiculite, which are the little white pieces in the soil, can help with that too. But yeah, it's never too late. You can always add more compost into things. So now is a good time to try it.
And what were you saying about Cashman's, about backing up with the truck? They have piles of soil you can purchase from them?
I believe they definitely do deliveries, like so you can purchase bulk soil from them. I used to buy my soil from a place in Missoula called Marchie's that was very similar to Cashman's, and they had, like, you could either get it delivered or you could go there with your pickup truck and they would bring a tractor and just dump it into your pickup truck for you.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure Cashman's would do the same thing, but I would call them first just to
Yeah.
make sure that that's an option.
Okay.
Yeah, great questions though.
Oh.
Ooh, we have chickens. Any advice for coordinating with your garden? Good question. I had chickens with my last garden, and my thing was I would try to like, now is a great time to let your chickens into your garden, if you can, because they will poop all over it, and that chicken manure is really good for, it's got tons of nitrogen in it. And then I like to let my chickens in the fall too to clean up all the mess, but I would just try to like fence them out if I could, or chase them out if they got into my garden once it started growing a lot, because I found at least my chickens really love to eat lettuce and they really love to eat my tomatoes and my berries. And so I would sort of just try to keep them out when things are growing that you might want to eat, that they might want to eat too, because they're omnivores and they will eat pretty much anything that they can find. Yeah, it's the same. I actually, my mother-in-law farms out in Three Forks, and she's got cows that she does the same thing with. She puts the cows in the garden during the winter so they can put compost or manure all over it, and then she moves them outside into the pasture in the summer. So gardening with animals is really great. And if you do have chickens, if you do add that chicken manure to your compost, if you are composting at your house, it can make a really wonderful, rich compost amendment to your garden. Folks will recommend against putting your chicken manure, like if you're cleaning out your coop, directly into your garden because it has so much nitrogen in it. So I found if they're just walking around and pooping every once in a while, it's fine, but you don't want to just like pile it around your plants. But if you break it down a little bit, it can be really, really great for your plants too. So, and chickens are great to give your garden scraps too, as well. So if you do have too much lettuce and it goes to flour, the chickens don't mind, they'll still eat it. Great. Any other questions, you guys? Well, thanks for sticking with us. We really appreciate all your insight and your thoughts and your questions. If as you're growing your gardens this year, you have additional ones, Maddie and I's emails are here on this page. It's and our website is gvfarmtoschool.org. Feel free to reach out. We're always happy to talk about growing plants. And then if you get to a point where you need some good recipes for all of your bounty, we're happy to share those too. And we are just really thankful to be here. And thank you again to Brianna and the Seed Library for inviting us to be a part of this. And hope everybody has good luck this season.
Yeah, and if you use an awesome container this summer, feel free to share your pictures with us. We would love to see your creative ideas.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for being here. This has been wonderful. And if there's any more questions that I get my way, I'll definitely pass them on to you.
Sounds great.
So much. And thank you everyone for attending tonight.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Great night.